New York Times bestseller Francis Fukuyama, author of The End of History and the Last Man. The Origins of Political Order, Volume 1 of 2, From Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. Part 3 of The Necessity of Politics, Getting to Denmark. The problem of creating modern political institutions has been described as the problem of getting to Denmark, after the title of a paper written by two social scientists at the World Bank, Lant Pritchett and Michael Woolcock. For people in developed countries, Denmark is a mystical place that is known to have good political and economic institutions. It is stable, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and has extremely low levels of political corruption. Everyone would like to figure out how to transform Somalia, Haiti, Nigeria, Iraq, or Afghanistan into Denmark. And the international development community has long lists of presumed Denmark-like attributes that they are trying to help failed states achieve. There are any number of problems with this agenda. It does not seem very plausible that extremely poor and chaotic countries could expect to put into place complex institutions in short order, given how long such institutions took to evolve. Moreover, institutions reflect the cultural values of the societies in which they are established, and it is not clear that Denmark's democratic political order can take root in a very different cultural contexts. Most people living in rich, stable, developed countries have no idea how Denmark itself got to be Denmark, something that is true for many Danes as well. The struggle to create modern political institutions was so long and so painful that people living in industrialized countries now suffer from a historical amnesia regarding how their societies came to that point in the first place. The Danes themselves are descended from the Vikings, a ferocious tribal people, if you know your history, who conquered and pillaged much of Europe, from the Mediterranean all the way to Kiev in southern Ukraine. The Celtic peoples who first settled the British Isle, as well as the Romans who conquered them, and the Germanic barbarians who displaced the Romans, were all originally organized into tribes, much like those that still exist in Afghanistan, Central Iraq, and Papua New Guinea. So were the Chinese, Indians, Arabs, Africans, and virtually all other peoples on earth. They owed primary obligation not to a state, but to kinfolk. They settled disputes not through courts, but through a system of retributive justice, and they buried their dead on property held collectively by groups of kin. Over the course of time, however, these tribal societies developed political institutions. First and foremost was the centralized source of authority that held an effective monopoly of military power over a defined piece of territory, what we call a state. Peace was kept not by a rough balance of power between groups of kin, but by the state's army and police, now a standing force that could also defend the community against neighboring tribes and states. Property came to be owned not by groups of kinfolk, but by individuals who increasingly won the right to buy and sell it at will. Their rights to that property were enforced not by kin, but by courts and legal systems that had the power to settle disputes and compensate wrongs. In time, moreover, social rules were formalized as written laws rather than customs or informal traditions. These formal rules were used to organize the way that power was distributed in the system, regardless of the individuals who exercised power at any given time. Institutions, in other words, replaced individual leaders. Those legal systems, i.e. institutions, were eventually accorded supreme authority over society, an authority that was seen to be superior to that of rulers who temporarily happened to command the state's armed forces and bureaucracy. This came to be known as the rule of law. Finally, certain societies not only limited the power of their states by forcing rulers to comply with written law, they also held them accountable to parliaments, assemblies, and other bodies representing a broader proportion of the population. Some degree of accountability was present in many traditional monarchies, but it was usually the product of informal consultation with a small body of elite advisors. Modern democracy was born when rulers acceded to formal rules limiting their power and subordinating their sovereignty to the will of the larger population as expressed through elections. The purpose of this text is to fill in some of the gaps of this historical amnesia by giving an account of where basic political institutions came from in societies that now take them for granted. The three categories of institutions in question are the ones just described: the state, the rule of law, and accountable government. A successful modern liberal democracy combines all three sets of institutions, i.e., the state, the rule of law, and accountable government, in a stable balance. The fact that there are countries capable of achieving this balance constitutes the miracle of modern politics, since it is not obvious that they can be combined. The state, after all, concentrates and uses power to bring about compliance with its laws on the part of its citizens, and to defend itself against other states and threats. The rule of law and accountable government, on the other hand, limit the state's power, first by forcing it to use its power according to certain public and transparent rules, and then by ensuring that it is subordinate to the will of the people. These institutions come into being in the first place because people find that they can protect their interests and the interests of their families through them. But what people regard as self-interest and how they are willing to collaborate with others depends critically on ideas that legitimate certain forms of political association. Self-interest and legitimacy thus form the cornerstones of political order. The fact that one of these three types of institutions exists does not imply that the others do so as well. Afghanistan, for example, has held democratic elections since the year 2004, but has an extremely weak state and is unable to uphold laws in much of its territory, now, of course, overrun by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So, Russia, for example, by contrast to Afghanistan, has a strong state and holds democratic elections, but its rulers do not feel bound by a rule of law. The nation of Singapore, a very, very important port for exports, has both a strong state and a rule of law bequeathed to it by its former British colonial masters, but only an attenuated form of democratic accountability. But where did these three sets of institutions originally come from? What were the forces that drove their creation and the conditions under which they developed? In what order were they created, and how did they relate to one another? If we could understand how these basic institutions came into being, we could then perhaps better understand the distance that separates Afghanistan or Somalia from contemporary Denmark. The story of how political institutions developed cannot be told without our first understanding the complementary process of political decay. Human institutions are sticky. That is, they persist over time and are changed only with great difficulty. Institutions that are created to meet one set of conditions often survive even when those conditions change or disappear, and the failure to adapt appropriately entails political decay. This applies to modern liberal democracies, encompassing the state, rule of law, and accountability as much as to older political systems. For there is no guarantee that any given democracy will continue to deliver what it promises to its citizens, and thus to get no guarantee that it will remain legitimate in their eyes. Moreover, the natural human propensity to favor family and friends, something I refer to as patrimonialism, constantly reasserts itself in the absence of strong countervailing incentives. Organized groups, most often rich and powerful, entrench themselves over time and begin demanding privileges from the state, particularly when a prolonged period of peace and stability gives way to financial and/or military crisis. These entrenched patrimonial groups extend their sway, or else prevent the state from responding adequately. A version of the story of political development and political decay has, of course, been told many times before. Most high schools offer a class on the rise of civilization, which presents a broad overview of the evolution of social institutions. A century ago, the historical account presented to most American school children was highly Eurocentric and indeed Anglo-centric. It might have begun in Greece and Rome, then progressed through the European Middle Ages, the Magna Carta, English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, and thence perhaps to the year 1776 and the writing of the United States Constitution. Today, however, such curricula are far more multicultural and incorporate the experiences of non-Western societies like China and India, as well as elsewhere on history's marginalized groups like indigenous peoples, women, the poor, and so on. There are several reasons to be dissatisfied with the existing literature on the development of political institutions. First, much of it is not comparative on a sufficiently broad scale. It is only by comparing the experience of different societies that we can begin to sort through complex causal factors that explain why certain institutions emerged in some places but not in others. A lot of theorizing about modernization, from the massive studies of Karl Marx to contemporary economic historians like Douglas North, has focused heavily on the experience of England as the first country to industrialize. The English experience was exceptional in many ways, but is not necessarily a good guide to development in countries differently situated. The multicultural approaches that have displaced this narrative in recent decades are not, for the most part, seriously comparative. They tend to select either positive stories on how non-Western civilizations have contributed to the overall progress of humankind, or else negative ones about how they were victimized. One seldom finds serious comparative analysis of why an institution developed in one society, but not in another. The great sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset used to say that an observer who knows only one country knows no countries. Without comparison, there is no way of knowing whether a particular practice or behavior is unique to the society in question, or common to many. Only through comparative analysis is it possible to link causes like geography, climate, technology, religion, or conflict to the range of outcomes existing in the world today. And in doing so, we might be able to answer questions like the following. Why are Afghanistan, the jungle regions of India, the island nations of Melanesia, and part of the Middle East still tribally organized? Why is China's default condition to be ruled by a strong centralized government, while India has never seen that degree of centralization, except for a very brief periods over the past 3 millennia of its history? Why is it that almost all of the cases of successful authoritarian modernization, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China, are clustered in East Asia rather than in Africa or the Middle East? Why have democracy and a strong rule of law taken root in Scandinavia, while Russia, subject to similar climatic and geographical conditions, experienced the growth of unconstrained absolutism? And why have countries in Latin America been subject to high inflation and economic crises repeatedly over the past century, while the United States and Canada have not? The historical data presented in this text are interestingly precise because they shed light on the present and explain how different political orders came to be. But human societies are not trapped by their pasts. If modern states emerged in China or Europe as a result of certain factors like the constant need to prepare for and fight wars, this does not necessarily mean that weak states in Africa today must replicate this experience if they are to modernize. Indeed, I will argue in the second volume that the conditions for political development today are very different from what they were in the periods covered by Volume 1. And again, Volume 1 covers from the French Revolution to the present day. The social deck is being constantly shuffled by economic growth, and international factors impinge to a much greater extent on individual societies than they did in the past. So, while the historical material in this text may explain how different societies got to where they are now, their path to the present do not determine their futures or serve as models for other societies. In our next reading, we will cover China first.